All right, everybody take a deep breath with me. How many of you like breathing? Isn't that good? Breathing is fun. It's good. What's your favorite? Do you like to inhale or exhale? What's your favorite? They kind of, both of them, they kind of come together as a joint package. Yeah. Breathing is good. We need to breathe. One day Jesus was teaching, and the guy said, Rabbi, what's the greatest commandment? He goes, I'm glad you asked. The greatest commandment is just to sit in God's presence and to worship him. To give God all and love him with all of your heart and your strength, your soul, your mind, everything. Just breathe in God's love and grace. And they went, great, thank you. And they started to leave. He goes, oh, no, don't stop. You've inhaled. But if that's all you do, you kind of walk around all puffed up in God's presence. But he asked you also to let that change and transform you to exhale, to love your neighbor as yourself. There's an inhale and an exhale. So we're in the second week of a series on the fruit of the Spirit. And we're going to take one fruit and we're going to do a deep dive every week. And sometimes I hope I can connect it all, but we're just going to take different from the Old and New Testament and just kind of point to how it all comes together. So you might walk away and say, okay, he put it all on a platter. I've got to connect the dots. But we're going to take a look at these things as best we can with the time we have. But every single one is going to have a component of inhaling and exhaling, of loving God and loving others. So let's start today with the word peace. And let's just remind ourselves what peace is not. Peace is not what? Avoiding a problem. Just because you or I have failed to discuss a problem doesn't mean that we have peace. Peace is not simply appeasing another person. It's not me trying to make you feel good or just get along with yourself, right? The word peace, biblical peace, comes from a word called shalom. But shalom is very complicated. It means more than just peace. Here's a definition of shalom. I wish there would be no conflict in your life, and I wish that there'd be a spirit of well-being and order in your inner being. It's not chaos. God brings order. It's a state of wholeness and sometimes the lack of conflict doesn't give. You have to have that harmony as well. And that infuses all of your relationships with God, relationship with yourself, and relationship with others. It's inherently social. Peace that's not simply in one's mind, but it's a way of life. So if we were going to think of this linear, you've got peace with God, you've got peace with yourself, and peace with others. So it starts off with peace with God. It starts off by looking at God and saying, you and I have to be in a right relationship. Now, the Hebrews called this righteousness, right standing. I am clean and pure. Go ahead and search me, because even if you find stuff, which you will, I'm good with you cleaning me up. I'm not Adam and Eve hiding naked and ashamed because you're going to see something that I know I shouldn't be doing, or you told me not to do and I'm still doing. No, it's me standing here righteous. We're good. And because we're good, I have peace with myself. Have you ever had an argument with a friend and you just feel yucky? That is what happens when you're not here. But once you're here, all of a sudden that yuckiness goes away and I'm good. And then you try to have peace with others or peace outside. We're going to pull this apart a little bit. In the book of Judges, chapter 6, verses 1 through 24, we're going to take these long 24 verses and just shrink it down to this. I said to you, I'm Yahweh, your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorite in whose land that you live. But guess what? They did. But you have not listened to me. So an angel of Yahweh Almighty appeared to a guy named Gideon. And he said, Yahweh is with you, mighty warrior. But the Lord said, peace, do not be afraid. So Gideon built an altar to Jehovah Shalom. All right, let's unpack this. So the Hebrew people are in the promised land, but they're worshiping other gods. And they're having a little tension with Yahweh. Yahweh's like, again, here we go. And so the Philistines continue to come over and raid them, takes their cattle, their sheep, it takes their grain, takes their women every now and then. So they're like, yikes, we got to hide. So they're hiding in the mountains and sleeping in the caves, and at night when it's dark and no one's around, then they sneak down to the threshing floor, and they start to thresh the grain so that they can make bread. And Gideon is down the threshing floor one night, and the image is almost casual. It's almost like an angel shows up with an apple, and he leans and says, "What's up, mighty warrior?" And Gideon looks and says, "What, mighty warrior? Are you kidding me?" Because there's tongue-in-cheek in the Hebrew there, because he's not a mighty warrior. But here's the beautiful thing the scriptures do, and God does if you look for it. They continue to look at somebody where they're at, and then they look at the potential of who they can be, and they speak that into them. Parents, you do that, I hope, with your kids. They speak the potential of what they can be. You don't tell them, "Oh, you're no good, you'll never amount to anything." That's not speaking that into them. It's speaking love and life and truth, and that's what's happening with Gideon. And Gideon says, "You're kidding me. We are the weakest nation right now. My tribe, we're the smallest tribe. And you're talking to the least of the tribe. You're talking to the bottom of the barrel." And the angel continues to talk to him and says, "Listen, God wants you to have peace with him. Because once you have peace with God, you're going to have peace with yourself. And you're going to start to understand who you really can be and what you can grow into. And then you're going to start to have peace with others." And the scripture says that Gideon took a bunch of rocks, because this is what they would do when they have a moment with God. They would take a bunch of rocks, maybe pour some oil over, and make that's called an altar for them. And then he said, "Thank you, Jehovah Shalom." Now, I get confused, because Jehovah Shalom means the God of peace. Why didn't you say Jehovah Banner, the God that victory? Why not God of war? Why not mighty warrior? Because what he's telling us is this is his moment that he got. The truth he's walking away from is, for me to be all that I can be, to help bring peace to my tribe, peace against the Philistines, for me to be everything I'm going to be, I first have to be good with the peace of God. It's that important. So Jesus was teaching the Sermon on the Mount. He's getting to the Beatitudes, and he's teaching about the Beatitudes. And he says this, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." Now, when he's doing this in context, they're being oppressed by the Romans, right? The Romans are occupying them. This is not a comfortable situation. And so the Jewish people are now kind of taking snipes at each other, because they're all trying to figure out how to interact with this conflict they have. And so the first group is the Sadducees. The Sadducees are the high priests. They're the ones that own the land. They're very wealthy. I'm not trying to make a political statement. I'm not being facetious, but maybe it's my own observation and I'm wrong. But it seems to me that there are people from the Democrats, the Republicans, and the Independents that go to Washington with very little money, and after they're there for a while, they come back and they're very wealthy. Am I the only one that notices this? I notice they come back and they have more money. That's the Sadducees. The Sadducees ran the temple. A side note, in 70 AD, after Jesus was dead, the Jewish people rose up in rebellion. The Romans came in and wiped them out. And then in history, you don't hear much about the Sadducees because they broke down the temple and they didn't have anything else. The temple was what's important to them. So they got upset with these other people, because if you guys cause problems, zealots, then what happens is we might lose our temple. And that's where we live. Then you had the Pharisees. The Pharisees were like the local church pastor. The Pharisees were good guys. Jesus liked the Pharisees. They were just off. And so the Pharisees, they believed in the law, what we would call the Old Testament, the first 5 books and the prophets and the history. But they would go to the temple. They thought going through the rituals were important, but the rituals had to have meaning, and the meaning came from the law. And so they got frustrated because sometimes the law butt heads with the Romans. And then you have the Essenes, and they were by the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're the ones that came from the Qumran community in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they just were hardliners that said, we got to get away from everybody because you all are icky. You're sinful. I got to be over here. And if we can just think pure thoughts and do pure thoughts and do enough washings and so forth, God will like us. And then you had the Zealots, and the Zealots were just trying to kill everybody. They just wanted to overthrow the government. And so Jesus comes along and he says to the Sadducees, listen, I appreciate what you're doing in the temple, but you got to have the law. And the Pharisees said, yeah, you got to have the law. And Jesus said to the Pharisees, yeah, but you've got to interpret it correctly, and you're not. And then he looked at the Essenes and said, hey, you guys, you're still in the world. How can you be a peacemaker if you're not around the conflict? And then he looked at the Zealots and just said, you got a lot of troubles, buddy. You're kind of a mess. And here's what he was saying. Next slide. Confrontation comes from the people who don't think you are making peace in the right way. Did you get that? Jesus is saying the way the world is right now, you will get caught in the crossfire of a lot of angry factions. And you will get hurt at times. But that doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. There are times when you're going to say, I'm going to be an Essene. I'm going to walk away and not even get involved. And you're thinking to yourself, sometimes it's okay. Sometimes you're like, I got to get involved. Because they're talking politics and we're going to ruin this for mom at dinner time, and we're not going to do that. And everyone's going to get, I'm going to get caught in the crossfire. Everyone's going to be upset with me, but we just got to get some peace here. Right? Anybody know the name Jacob from the Bible? Yeah. So Jacob, he had his name changed to what? Israel. And Israel had 12 sons, and that's called the sons of Israel, and they become known as Israel. And so then they come into the promised land, and you have the top 10 tribes, the 10 tribes, they're Israel. And then you have 3 tribes that come down here and become Judah. So Israel is right up here, bumped up next to Assyria, and they're having fights. And so Assyria is coming down more and more to take over. And these guys see what's happening. So the king ran over to Egypt and said, Egypt, hey, will you help us if we get into a fight? And they said, sure, give us some money. So they gave him some money, and he goes, yeah, they didn't help him. They just, yeah, sure, we'll take some money from you. And so here's these guys, and Isaiah the prophet looks at the kings here and says, here's the problem. God has no problem with you being strategic, but you're not focusing in on him. You're not having a relationship with God. You're worshiping other gods. You're trying to find your peace with death. You can't do that. Therefore, hear the word of the Lord God Almighty Yahweh, you scoffers who rule these people in Jerusalem. You boast, we have entered into a covenant with death, because Egypt they worshiped some gods of death. So we've entered into a covenant with death. With the grave, we've made an agreement. Now he's going to be mocking them. When an overwhelming scourge or scourge, the Assyrian sweeps by, it cannot touch us, for we have made a lie our refuge and falsehood our hiding place. He's mocking them. And then he says, so this is what the sovereign Lord says. See, I lay a stone in Zion, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone for a sure foundation, the one whose trust will never be dismayed. I will make justice, exhaling, taking care of others, the widows, the poor, the measuring line, and righteousness, peace with God, the plumb line. And so what he was talking about was this big cornerstone, foundation stone. You see how tall it is compared to everything else? This became the altar of the Holy of Holies. In the first temple, this is where the Ark of the Covenant would be. In the second temple, they lost the Ark, so the second temple, this is where the high priest would come in once a year and put down blood for the sacrifice of sins. And so Jesus is teaching. And he's teaching right there in the shadows of the temple. And he says this, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? I'll show you what he is like who comes to me and hears my words and puts them into practice. He is like a man building a house who dug down deep and laid the foundation on a rock. When a flood came, the torrent struck that house, but could not shake it because it was well built. But the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck that house, it collapsed, and its destruction was complete. Here's the deal. Both houses go through storms. You can be a follower of Jesus and still go through a storm. Bad things happen to good people. It's, do you have peace through that storm? Do you have peace that he's navigating you through that storm? So there's all sorts of storms we go through, right? Sudden, unexpected bad news, relational breakdowns, financial pressure, you cross moral boundaries, or you're facing your mortality. So here's the deal, real quick, 3 things. When I'm dealing with peace, and I think it comes from the Bible, the first thing you need to do is just call a time out. I'm in the middle of this argument. I'm in the middle of stress. I need to call a time out and just step back for a second. Because the first thing they do in time out is this. There's basketball. I love the Bucks. So they're playing basketball. Back and forth, there's tension. And there's just who's got the momentum. And when this team has the momentum, you call a timeout, you bring your people over and say, listen, we can't control what they're doing, but we can control what we're doing. So let's deal with that. There have been times, multiple times, where people have come up to me and said, Pastor Creighton, do you know so-and-so? I think so, yeah. They're mad at you. Well, that's too bad. I'm sorry. And I walk away, and they're like, well, weren't you going to do something about it? And I said, what am I going to do? I barely know them. Why are they mad at me? I'm not chasing anybody. I can't control what they've done. If they're mad at me, then they can come to me and explain why we're mad, and we can reconcile, and we can bring peace together. But I can't control everybody that's angry at me. That's a full-time job, right? So the first thing you have to do is call a timeout. Everybody say babushka. Now you got to say with feeling, babushka. Now, get the hands going. Ready? Babushka. Babushka. This is one of my favorite true stories. A babushka is a head covering, but in Poland and Russia, babushka is the grandmother. So back when you're back in Russia and the agnostics and the communists are really going thick and the wall is still up, they allowed the churches to stay open, but it wasn't the priests that kept them open. It was the babushkas. The priests were mostly corrupt. The babushkas taught their children and their grandchildren and kept the faith alive. In 1991, there was that failed coup. So some of you remember Mikhail Gorbachev, and then there's Yeltsin, and they pulled down the wall, and they're trying to give freedom to people. The hardliners were upset, the Putins. There was one of them, Putin's, because they didn't like all that freedom. So Yeltsin's in his presidential palace, which is like our White House, and he wakes up one day and it's surrounded by tanks, and they're doing a coup. And a handful of Yeltsin's soldiers come and get in place to try to protect him. You know, they're like there with their little water guns, and these guys have got tanks. It's going to not be good at all. And it was the babushkas who took a little bread, a little meat, and they started walking to make sure that Yeltsin and his men were fed, because they couldn't get out. And so some of these young soldiers from the tanks got down, and they put their guns and said, go home, go home. And those little ladies took the barrel of the gun, put it right there, and said, what are you going to do, grandchild? You going to shoot grandma? Are you going to shoot? Go ahead, shoot grandma. Get out of the way. And they went, and they took care of these guys. One of my favorite images, and I can't find it anymore, was a little grandma who still had her purse or a basket, I couldn't tell what it was, and she's climbing up on top of a tank. And the angle wasn't necessarily flattering to her, because you could see her little stockings that came up to about here, and she was crawling up, and she was banging on the tank, and they said she was saying, grandchild, grandson, go home. Don't hurt grandfather. Go home. Then, and only then, did all of a sudden these college students get involved and would pull the soldiers out. And if you go back and read history, it'll say the young people came and saved the day. The young college students came and stepped in, and it's true. But if you go dig deeper, they didn't do anything until the babushkas came. Now, why do I tell you that? Because some of you are going through a lot of things that are disrupting your peace. And you're looking at me and saying, Creighton, time out. That sounds like a cliche. You don't know what I'm going through. No, I don't. But I know that the babushkas had to go and keep a church open during agnostic times. And they went and they stopped the coup. And if they could do a timeout and stop those things, I'll bet you can dig hard enough to just for a moment say, I got to catch my breath. I got to make sure that I am having peace with God so it doesn't rob the peace I have here. And that takes us to the second thing. You got to then, when you take the time out, think of your foundations. How are you going to live between the now and the point of possible resolution? How do you live in this stressful time? Will you let it rob your peace? Or are you going to be somebody put on firm foundation and let it navigate? Because the parable of the firm foundation, that's a true story. In Israel, it's one big rock. And so when you build your house, if you're fortunate, there's only 2 or 3 inches of soil. So you get the soil out of the way, you build your house, you're in good shape. But there are places where there's 10 feet of clay, and clay is hard to move. And so what happens is people go to build their house, and they love Jesus. Thank you, Jesus. I'm building my house, and I'm going to go to church, and I'm going to put $1 in the offering plate. I'm going to sing the hymns and the praise song. Oh, this is hard work. I'm 5 feet down. No more. This is all you're going to get, God. I'll come to church every now and then because I'm tired. And then the storms of life hit. And when the storms of life hit, this whole clay thing turns to pudding. And everything gets topsy-turvy. And you lose your peace, and you're looking at God and saying, where'd you go? Where are you? First you take a time out, and then you go back, and the first thing you say is, okay, before everything else, I got to stand over here and say, are we good? If not, search my heart. Because when I get the peace here, I'm anchored into something. And I have the peace here, now I can figure out how to take care of the peace there, which leads to the last thing, and that's action steps, action items. True story, man told me I could tell, I just can't tell his name. About 10 years ago, he came into my office from church. He's still around. He said, Pastor Creighton, I need to talk with you. I said, okay. Now what he was trying to say, but he didn't say, is he was upset. He was losing his peace. He said, I make over $300,000 a year. I said, wow, good for you. He goes, I don't give the church a nickel. I said, boo, boo. You should be supporting the church, the movement of God. He goes, Creighton, I'm in debt all the time. I don't know where my money goes. I said, do you have a budget? He goes, no. I'm surprised at how many people our age don't have budgets. Once you get enough money, you just forget. And if you start to look, you're like, man, I eat out a lot. I do a lot of this. I spend money in a lot of frivolous places. So I said, you need an action item, and you need to have accountability. You need to meet with somebody. You need to downsize. Do you really seriously need 3 cars? Do you really seriously need a boat and a motorcycle? Do you really need all of this stuff? And so we talked. And to my knowledge, he's still holding himself accountable with somebody. I had a guy, a pastor friend, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, who came up to me and said, I deal with pornography, and it's starting to interfere not only with my life and the ministry that I'm doing, but with my wife. He goes, I need you to be holding me accountable. Will you call me once a year and we'll talk about it? And I said, yes. And we did that for about 6 months. And then he called and said, you know what? I got a new appointment, a new church, and there's some people there, other pastors. We're okay. And I said, well, good. Sometimes you have to have an action step to get the peace back. Listen, I prided myself all my life for working out. That's what I did. I would work out all the time. Why don't the ushers come forward, please, and get ready. I would pride myself on exercise. I was the guy that people called when they were moving. Creighton's got a strong back. Creighton's got muscles. Come on, bring Creighton. I can't do that, and I have chronic pain. And my back and my weight, it starts to rob my peace. I have to spend a lot of time talking to God to keep this going so that I have the peace to get through this. It must have been about 15 years ago. My youngest son, Sawyer, some of you know him. Sawyer's a bit of a character. And when he was about 10 years of age, we were up at Door County, and we just watched the sun set. And we were having one of those nice, warm, fuzzy family moments. And we're walking to get some ice cream and talk. And I said, kids, Dad's got to get his weight under control. I still exercised all the time, but my back was starting to hurt bad, and I'd gained extra weight. And I said, I got to get my weight under control. And they said, what are you going to do? And I said, I'm going to go do medical weight loss. Well, what is that? I said, I'm going to go once a week. I'm going to stand on a scale. Someone's going to look at it, and then they're going to talk to me about what I need to do to get better. And every week I'll go give them $20, stand on a scale, and we'll have a conversation for accountability. Well, Sawyer, after about 15 seconds, said, Dad, I got an idea. And I said, what? He said, you give me $15, I'll tell you to quit eating my chips, and we don't even have to leave the house. What is it that's ruining your peace? It could be something like chronic pain. It can be something like unforgiveness, either receiving it or giving it. It can be a bad attitude. It can be bitter. What's robbing you of your peace? Get your relationship with God right. It'll give you the peace that you have here and help you so you can have the peace there. And you start with God.